Let me welcome you again, and I want to remind you that we have channels, language channels at the bottom of your screen. You'll be able to choose the interpretation icon and choose your channel. And we would really appreciate it if you could keep your mics on mute so that we can listen to our speakers clearly. And when you want to ask your question, then you'll open your mic. Thank you. Good morning in Mexico. Good evening in Spain. It's my honor to welcome you to this presentation of a book launch from Vaso Roto for Latin America. It is the book, the biography on Elizabeth Bishop, this called author. The title is Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, published by Vaso Roto, and for the first time, it is introduced in Spanish for Latin America. This is from the author of Megan Marshall, who we welcome and joins us this morning. Thank you so much. Welcome to this Pulitzer Prize winner. And she will be talking to us about this book. And also joining us is María Fuentes from Delegate editorial of Vaso Roto in Spain, and María Covarrubias, who is interpreting. We will get started with a first intervention from María Fuentes. She will share with us about this launch for the summer in our language of Un Milagro para el Desayuno, the biography of Elizabeth Bishop, written by Megan Marshall. Welcome, Maria. Go ahead.
You're muted.
You're muted. Thank you so much, Lorena. And good morning in the American continent and good evening in the European continent. I want to thank everyone who's joining us today to share this little bit of time to talk about one of my favorite authors for Vaso Roto, who is Elizabeth Bishop. Thank you, Megan Marshall, who joins us, and especially for entrusting us with her great work and for the wonderful work that she's done. Thank you to our translators and Ana Clarion in poetry. I want to be very brief. The only thing I want to share with you is why Elizabeth Bishop and why this biography on Elizabeth Bishop. It is essential to know about Vaso Roto. Vaso Roto is a publishing house by Janet Lozano Clarion with the mission of getting the best poetry to Spanish speakers, regardless of where it's been created. After more than 18 years, we've come to age, and we can say that we are a well-established publishing house that has a reading base, which is very important. And they have published more than 300 titles in more than 33 different languages. Now, we would have to go back to when Vaso Roto began. And when we began, we had to set the grounds. And for me, the pillars that Jeanette set herself to for the catalog were three wonderful poets. One is Alla Marina, Italian, and the other two are two poets that are Canadian, but that are here in this book, which is The School of Wallace Stevens, that Janet worked with the other author. This was published in 2011, and one of these authors was highly unknown for the Spanish market, Anne Carson, and the other one was Elizabeth Bishop. I would like to read a small fragment of Harold Bloom says in the intro about Elizabeth Bishop. It's very meticulous and original, and her work has not been read with the depth that it deserves. That's why there is a tendency to underestimate her. Frequently, they garner her achievement relies on seeing what cannot be seen and say what cannot be said. I would like to tell you that Vaso Roto was the first house that published Elizabeth Bishop, but I would be lying. There was already an anthology, a partial anthology of her work, and some college translations. However, her work was not understood, and especially in the Latin American market. So Vaso Roto decided to do a translation and a thorough translation of her full work. It took us years. In 2016, we have the full work of Elizabeth Bishop, including the 4 poem books that she published while alive, and also including her unedited poetry. These were worked with their literary alias, and they were published following the wishes of the author in her will. Later on, they also published La Prosa Completa. We used, and also the Brazilian poetry, anthology of Brazilian poetry, and 2 biographies that were focused exclusively in the period where Elizabeth Bishop lived in Brazil. Now the question comes. We understand why the importance of Elizabeth Bishop in literature. Now, why is she a pillar for Vaso Roto? We like to think that we create poetic constellations. Some authors lead us to other authors. Elizabeth Bishop is a pillar because thanks to her, we have the cosmogony that is the most important ones in Vaso Roto. Through Elizabeth Bishop, we get to authors like Helen Bellner or the incomparable Robert Lowell. So this author has provided for many gifts, and we have met and we have learned a lot. Now, why, after all these years, we decided to launch Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, the more thorough and complete biography and artistically poetic that I have been able to read. I would like to tell you that Elizabeth Bishop oftentimes has been considered a poet that is distant. She would precisely, Octavio Paz actually said, she defined Elizabeth Bishop as the power of reticence, of contention. But sometimes in her work, we see sparks of, like in the poem, Un Arte, that I love, and let me read a small fragment of it. It's not difficult to master the loss. They lose something every day. It's not difficult to master the art of losing. I lost the watch of my mother. And when I read this poem, I had to learn to know deeply what the 2 continents were, what the houses were, what happened with the watch of her mother. And thank you to the wonderful work of Megan Marshall, I have been able to discover these with a very fruitful and poetic reading. Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you for this gift.
Thank you, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. And it's thrilling to me that Elizabeth Bishop has been taken so to heart by Vaso Roto, because she really is. This is one of the reasons I decided to write this biography, which came out a few years ago in English. There was a biography written in the early 1990s, but her reputation has really soared since then. She had won kind of every prize there was in the United States, and even an international, the Neustadt Prize. Before her death at 68 in, it's telling me I switched to a different language, which I didn't mean to do. And I'm going to go back to my English. Okay. Sorry. At any rate, you know, she won this International Neustadt Prize, the first woman and the first American to win that. But she was really known mostly to poets. And since her death at 68 in 1979, just a few years after I had been her student in a Harvard class in 1976, you know, interestingly, her reputation really began to rise. It was partly because a collection of her letters were published, a collection of her letters with Robert Lowell. She died with no direct descendants, so her papers went really right to the archive and right to biographers and scholars who wanted to learn, as Maria said, what was the life that gave birth to these poems. What I tried to do in my biography was to kind of write the poems back into the life. There are only 100 of her poems that she published. Maria mentioned the others that were unpublished that have also come out in recent years. But she was so exacting and so ambitious to write poems that really expressed her deepest feelings. She said, writing poetry is like thinking with your feelings. That's what she was trying to do. And very early on, she said, you know, if I could just write one poem that would be immortal, that would be, you know, all that really mattered to her. Of course, she kept writing more than that, but that poem that Maria read from One Art, The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master, really, that was one of her last poems, published, I think, in 1975, about a breakup that she'd experienced, but it took in all the loss that she'd experienced in a long life, going back to her father's death when she was 8 months old, and her mother's mental instability, and Elizabeth Bishop essentially grew up as an orphan without the father, and her mother institutionalized, and then lovers who you know, died of broken hearts, that sort of thing. All of that was in that poem, The Art of Losing Isn't Hard to Master, a very wry and heartfelt one that she referred to as her tearjerker. That poem has really caused her reputation to rise. What I was going to say was, I'm very pleased with this translation. My Spanish isn't very strong, but I can tell that the poems are very well translated by Jeanette Lozano and the prose by Laura Fernandez. It's so important that the translators of this book really understood the interplay between the poetry and the prose. There are a lot of full poems quoted in the book that are meant to help a reader who, you know, not all readers think they can understand poetry. And this is part of my goal of the book, why I have interwoven my own story of getting to know Elizabeth Bishop as my teacher with her life story, so that the reader can, by identifying with me when I was a college student learning poetry, through that learn the poetry as well. And the title itself, A Miracle for Breakfast, refers to one of Elizabeth Bishop's early poems, which is a sestina, and that's the form that I used to write this book. The book is sort of a prose sestina. A sestina is a poem of 6 stanzas with 6 lines each, and the end word of each line is repeated in a specific way. So the end words, well, anyway, you can just see them beautifully in here. I don't know, you can probably read this yourself. I hope you have copies. This is the end of the sestina. The last 6 stanzas starts here at the beginning of the book, and the last line here ends with balcony. And then the chapter about Elizabeth Bishop is called Balcony. I've used those 6 end words as chapter titles, and they really follow Elizabeth's life. Balcony, she's starting out. Crumb, she feels like just kind of worthless. What's she going to be? That's her early 20s. Coffee, she moves to Brazil. River, she stays in Brazil, and things get complicated. Life is flowing. And then there's let's see, how many have we gone through? Miracle and Sun, River, Miracle and Sun. Anyway, I won't spoil the plot for you, but it was so important to me that this poem was translated well with those end words accurate, so that then the titles of the chapters would make sense and the reader can follow my whole program there. And I'll tell you a little secret that Sestina ends with 3 lines that use all those 6 words in it, and I made sure to use those 6 words in the very last sentence of my book. So when you get there, you'll see it. Let me think. I was going to just say a little bit more about, oh, yes. So there had been a biography published in the early 90s, but that was a time when it wasn't really, you couldn't write so openly about same-sex romantic life. And so by the time I was writing, there were more letters from Elizabeth Bishop that she exchanged with her lovers. Those had come to light. There was a series of letters she'd written to her psychoanalyst in the 40s that revealed a lot about a very painful childhood, an abusive uncle, her sort of early sexual awakening, that was in those letters. There's just so much more to work with, that a whole new biography needed to be written. And since I had known her, I really felt I could give a kind of wider perspective. So the chapters that are focused on Bishop, you're following her life, and then you get a little chapter where I'm meeting her for the first time, and you're stepping back and seeing how she interacts. She was a very shy woman, but she invited our class to a party, and we got to meet her in her apartment in Boston on the waterfront and see, the Brazilian artifacts that she had around her, and see her in a whole new light, which I think was really important to open up to the reader. So I'm going to get a little drink of water, and maybe we can start taking some questions. Here we go. I guess I also want to say that Spanish was a language that was very meaningful to Elizabeth Bishop. She studied it in the 1930s and 40s, and she traveled to Mexico, was there for 6 months, and met Pablo Neruda, who was there on a posting in 1942, became very close friends with him. She translated a few of Octavio Paz's poems, not published, and a very meaningful poem to her was an elegy by Miguel Hernandez, a Spanish poet who died in prison at the end of the Civil War. That elegy was very meaningful to her in writing ultimately what became that great poem, One Art. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction of your work. And now we would like to hear from our colleagues from the press. Does anybody have any questions? Please go ahead.
I'll say also, Elizabeth Bishop said that translating, she found it very hard to do, is like trying to put your feet into gloves. So I have a great admiration for anyone who does it well.
I would like to ask you, Megan, into how many languages has this work been translated into, in addition to Spanish?
Yeah, Spanish is the first translation that I've had. Some of my other biographies have been translated into Japanese, actually, and maybe that will be next for Elizabeth Bishop. But it's available in English pretty widely. And I think one of the keys to this translation was that Jeanette had already translated these poems into Spanish quite wonderfully. And so it was not easy, but it made a lot of sense to go ahead with this biography. I don't think there are any other biographies of Bishop in any other language than English.
Go ahead, Enrique Vasquez. Do you have a question? Yes, I would like to know what was more interesting for you, for the author, with respect to the reactions of the readers, what they have shared with you?
That's a good question. I think there are kind of two types of response. Maybe you could mute because we're getting a little feedback. First is from people who said, I thought I couldn't understand poetry, and they were reluctant to read a biography of a poet. And they said that they, my whole plan to kind of make this an introduction to poetry as well as an introduction to Bishop and her poetry seemed to have worked. So that has made me very happy. Then there are responses from people who knew Bishop's poetry well and even knew Elizabeth Bishop, and they I've been glad to hear that they feel I really captured her personality, captured her character, and showed things that they had not known about before. She was a very private woman, and I didn't want to, I wanted to respect that, but I also wanted to show that she, the passion that she had for the women in her life. And that has been very moving to people, to find that these relationships that she generally described as, this is my friend, or this is my assistant, were deep and loyal and intense, passionate love relationships that were, one of my favorite poems of hers is called The Shampoo, which she wrote after falling in love with Lota de Macedo Soares in Brazil. It's very, just the slightest bit suggestive of a romantic relationship. And she had a lot of trouble publishing that. She was published all the time in the New Yorker, but they wouldn't publish this poem. It was too risky for them. This is in the 50s. And the New Republic finally did. But I think that, scared her off from writing outright love poems. There are some love poems that were not published, and that they are also in my book. But anyway, so I've been very happy to find that people who didn't know her felt excited to learn poetry and learn about her, and people who did know her felt that I got it right. Thank you.
Pilar Martin, and then Luis Carlos Sanchez. Hi, Megan. It's a pleasure. I would like for you to share with us. I do agree with what Maria shared about the poetic character and the poetic vision of this book, a very special view. And I think that it's very interesting. The structure is very interesting, the way in which you structured it. Could you share a little bit about how you got to this idea of structure and this poetic character for the book?
Thank you so much. Yeah, she's referring to the alternating of very brief memoir passages where I track my connection with Elizabeth Bishop, alternating with the longer biographical ones. And there's sort of two plots. There's a plot of Megan, wanting to become a writer, and finally towards the end having that vision begin to be realized. It's sort of the coming into realization of wanting to be a writer, as Bishop's own life as a writer is coming to a close. It's kind of poetic in that way. And I don't want to give anything away, but I didn't really get along with Elizabeth Bishop in the class. I thought she was mad at me. In fact, she was mad at me. So that is resolved there. But I really wanted to separate those strands. I didn't want to be popping in and out of the narrative of her life. I needed to step back from it. But I also, and I don't know if this is clear in the book, but Elizabeth Bishop struggled with alcoholism, pretty much from the first time she began to drink in college. And I had grown up with a father with a drinking problem. And I, as a result of that, really had very little patience for alcohol, people who had troubled relationships because of their alcoholism, which she certainly did. And in writing my little autobiographical section, I was able to step back and not judge her with the eyes of someone who was, the adult child of an alcoholic. And I could really sympathize with the struggle that she had. She wasn't happy with that about herself either. So I that was part of my thinking about how to separate them. And I don't know, it was an experiment. I had written 2 other biographies in a more traditional way, and you know, one of them won the Pulitzer Prize, and I thought now's the time to try something new. I'm glad it's working for you. Thank you.
Luis Carlos Sanchez, and then Reina and Monica. Thank you. Hi, good morning. I have a couple of questions. One is about Megan's work as a biographer and the admiration that the biography needs to have on the subject. Can you share something about this admiration that you felt for Bishop? And does this admiration, or did this admiration led you to get deeper into her life? And on the second question, I would like to know, as you describe it, the pain that Bishop had within, what do you think, what meant poetry for Bishop? What did that mean to her? Thank you.
Great questions. The admiration I had for her, you know, I think this was actually a good exercise for me as a biographer, because I admired her as a poet. She had hurt me as a aspiring poet, and I wasn't sure I would be able to come to like her as I wrote the book, which is another reason I separated out the my personal story. But I think there's a notion called sympathetic identification. I think that's something that the biographer, if you're lucky, you go through. You've chosen a subject who is admirable, who, in her case, I mean, even the way she treated me, I began to understand as part of her, it's just who she was in life. She couldn't always put herself in somebody else's shoes. She was a frightened, lonely orphan, really, at heart. And she needed people to shore her up. That was a lot of what she was doing in her relationships, was finding people who could be supportive of her, even as she would sometimes then come to resent that dependence, because she knew essentially she was on her own. She was alone. So the pain that she felt was the pain of an orphan. And a lot of experiences, you know, then being shuttled from one relative's house to another. In one place, the place she lived the longest, she was living with her aunt and uncle, and the uncle was abusive. She was glad to get off to boarding school and to camp. At camp, there was a female counselor who seduced her when she was just 13 or 14, which she kind of liked, but also kind of didn't. You know, that's not right. She liked the attention she got, but she realized this was inappropriate. All of this is new material in this book. And in college, you know, in high school, she would come home to that. She was in the boarding school. She'd come home to the aunt and uncle, but once she was in college, she rarely went home there. She would sometimes stay in a hotel because she had no place to go on the vacation. She had a little bit of money, so she could stay in a kind of not very nice hotel, or she could go to friends' houses. One of her friends said that in boarding school, she had 300 books of poetry in her room. And you can see that she's building her home. But did she have a home? That was one of the great things about falling in love in Brazil, was suddenly she did have a home and someone to support her who would build her a study where she could work. But I think, so what did poetry mean to her? It's interesting to me that she started writing poetry very young, and she wrote like crazy in the summer camp and in high school, and loved to go to a secondhand bookstore on Cape Cod where she could pick up poetry. She was very prolific as a poet in those ages, and even in the summer camp, they took turns publishing a log for the campers. She wrote hers in verse. So why did she, when she, you know, refined her ambition and began practicing as an adult poet, why did she slow down? Well, of course, she was very a perfectionist, but I think she also, that's when she began to see that she couldn't write just anything that came to her. She envied Robert Lowell. She said, all you have to do is write down the names, you know, the people in his family. He didn't have to hide his loves. She was hiding, you know, she was hiding embarrassment about her parents. She was hiding her love for women. She was hiding her alcoholism. So I think that slowed her down. But at the same time as the poetry was like a life raft for her. That's what I'd say. And it was great poetry. You know, many people write poetry for that reason, and that's not always good. But she had the mind for it. She read. She was kind of self-educated. This before there were, you know, graduate programs in poetry. She made herself the poet she was.
Now I will read the question from Reina Paz. I would like to know how much the loneliness and the childhood of Bishop to influence her poetry. Did she give it value to it so that she wouldn't abandon literature?
She read a lot in childhood, and her aunts were great readers and read to her. Very supportive of her writing. There's one really wonderful poem of hers. I mean, there are probably several poems where she's writing about herself as a child, but one in particular that has just the title Sestina, and I quote a fair amount of it in the book, which recalls the day. It's another sestina with these 6 end words that are repeated, different ones. And she recalls the day in Nova Scotia when, as a child, her mother that night had been taken off to the mental hospital. And this is a morning in the breakfast that after that, where she's sitting with her grandmother and they're both crying. And the child, she doesn't say whether it's a girl or a boy, which I think is very interesting because she did kind of, in a certain way, she was a tomboy, what we would call a tomboy back in those days. And so it's just a child, and the child is drawing. You know, the child probably can't write yet, but the child is drawing, the child is making art, and the grandmother is weeping into the porridge that she's stirring on the stove. It's a beautiful poem, and it really preserves that moment. There's also, she did write a few short stories, and one's called In the Village that also recalls that time. So I think, as many writers do, she was drawing on her childhood experience and her childhood feelings. As I said, she said poetry is thinking with one's feelings. And she wanted a poem. This was kind of her own idea of it, that a poem should be able to enact the thought process. It should show the mind in action. It should show the mind in action. And that's something that she was very good at. Something that's typical of her poems is sort of making these asides or correcting herself, or it's kind of conversational, which is something she learned a bit from Marianne Moore, who was a mentor to her, an older woman poet, and even T.S. Eliot in a way, with many different kinds of diction. But Elizabeth's voice is always her voice, or almost always her voice. There are a few poems that speak through someone else's voice, but and it's an enchanting one. Thank you.
Monica asked, the art of losing is a poem, and she is a poet that is very well adjusted to our time. Do you feel that way, that is why she is still current?
Yes, you know, the poets who were you know, really kind of getting a lot of attention when she was still alive in the 1960s and 70s, were many of them known as the confessional poets. And you know, Sylvia Plath and Robert Lowell was leading the way, kind of bearing their souls, and often in very particular ways. And Elizabeth Bishop, although there was a lot of emotion in some of her poems, she was much more drawn to writing a kind of poetry of that in the end, I think speaks more widely, because it's not just pinned to a particular event in a particular person's life. We all can feel that loss. There is some particularity to that poem, but you can see there actually, and I write a lot about that poem and how it came to be. That initially it was about her lover, Alice Methvessel, who was going to leave her in that fall of 1975, I think it was, and her feelings of loss about that. And there's particular details that you can identify as Alice. But as she refined it, she moved farther away from those particular details, and now it could be Lotta, who had died of suicide or an overdose as their relationship was falling apart in 1967, I think it was. So that is the elegy she'd always wanted to write and was working on when she was trying to translate the Hernandez elegy. So yes, I think that poem, and there's a wonderful poem that was always very popular or widely read, called The Fish, that she wrote in the 1940s, I think. I'm trying to have to look back. And it's, again, it's, it could be any fish. It could be any fisher person, male or female, catching a fish and admiring the fish and seeing that the fish is battle scarred, actually, and has survived many, like it's got 5 or 6 hooks in it, and it's a beautiful fish. And in the end, she lets the fish go, and she sees, a kind of rainbow in the oil slick behind the motor of the little, putt-putt boat that she's on. And it's a vision, an ecstatic vision, rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. You don't have to have been there with that particular fish to have a kind of transcendent vision of, this other being, a kind of almost human other animal, and its travails, in which you identify, and then you let him go and give the life back to that struggling, battle-scarred fish, who, maybe that's you as well. So I think you're right that her poetry is more universal than, as it turns out, the poetry of the confessionals was.
The next question is from Janet Aguilar. Her question is, what are Bishop's topics that you feel keep her current and still have an impact on the new generation of poets? Another question, what are, for you, Megan, the topics that are you most obsessed about and that you want to keep learning more of?
Well, as to the topics that Bishop wrote about, and that, I often ask other poets, what are your favorite poems of hers? And she writes quite a few poems just about the common person in Brazil, for example, or really anywhere. There's a poem called Filling Station, about stopping by at a gas station, we would say, and in Brazil, and it's not so much that she doesn't actually see the people there, but she can tell by the little potted plants and the lace doilies, that this is a place, even this godforsaken place, is a place of the spirit and of divinity. So she can find the divine in the commonplace. There's another that's about, just the town pump in the small village in Brazil where she was living, and the people who gathered there and what they're talking about, and another kind of ecstatic rainbow vision comes from that. So I think she grew up, one of her grandfathers was well-to-do in Worcester, Massachusetts, and through him she could go to the boarding school, she could go to Vassar College, but the grandparents she really loved and felt safe with were in this great village, a little tiny town in Nova Scotia, and that grandfather had been a tanner, tanning hides back when that was possible. And they, living a very primitive life. And that was what she was always, I think, yearning for and longing for, and why she had a great understanding for all sorts of people. I think that's one of the reasons she wanted to learn Spanish. Was she lived in New York City for a while. She lived in Key West, and that was the language that was spoken by so many people. And she wanted to understand it. And that's kind of who she was. She didn't have very, that her own sense of being adrift and having a precarious life caused her to identify with other people whose lives were precarious. She wrote a kind of ballad about a Robin Hood-like figure in the favela in Rio, who was, being sought by the police. And that was a long poem that's almost like a children's rhyme, but and it was published in a special edition with beautiful illustrations. But she was always rooting for the common person. And so as far as the things that I'm obsessed by, that's a very good question. I'm very interested in women's struggle to be heard, and in women's, the obstacles that women face of all sorts, to find their voice. And that's really a common theme through all the books that I've written.
Thank you so much. Reyes Martinez is asking about the impact of the transit of Bishop through the world to build her poetic world, both in Brazil, France, Mexico, and also with the contact of adding languages and this developing. How did this constant moving and these languages, how did these impact her work?
That's a very good question. She really struggled in Brazil because she had learned Spanish pretty well, and she found it really difficult to take in the Portuguese. Although she did most of the translation that she did and that she published was from the Portuguese. She'd also spent a fair amount of time in France and was kind of taken by the Surrealist poets. She wrote at one point that she believed in a kind of surrealism of everyday life. That is, again, objects can take on huge meanings, even if they're small, that kind of thing. But English was her language. She didn't write in any other language. She did read, though. I was impressed. She read Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex in French, which was a lucky thing because the English translation was terrible from what I've learned. A lot left out, and so it was interesting. She liked it quite a lot, and of course a lot of people did, but some reviewers were critical, and she couldn't understand that, having read it in French, I guess. Some reviewers in English. So but I think there's also this sestina form. Interestingly, it goes back it's not an English form. It's sort of Italian and Spanish and French. That it's a very ancient form, and she was one of the people who revived it. Now, if you go to a MFA program, you probably have to be assigned to write a sestina. I wrote a sestina. We all practiced it, but when she started writing this in 1936, I think it was, A Miracle for Breakfast, hardly anyone was writing that way. And so that's another way in which her, deep investigation of the forms of poetry, which she approached through English poetry, still took her back to a kind of global sense, or at least, transcontinental or intercontinental origins of poetry that she then helped her become an original poet.
Thank you. Now we have the question from Nestor Ramirez that says, good morning, a couple of questions. What was the process to rescue her poems, letters, and documents that were in Brazil and other countries? What is Bishop's connections to sea or the ocean? And what did the ocean mean to her?
Those are good questions. I wish I knew more precisely about how these letters were gathered. I know that not too long after she died, her publisher, Robert Giroux, decided to publish a collection of her letters. And I think he must have written to all of her friends and said, please send. But there are also many, I mean, and I guess, you know, I don't know, they have ended up, most of them at Vassar College. And the sea, she loved travel by boat. I mean, she loved the ocean. She loved to sail. That was something she learned in the summer camp on Cape Cod. And she was really drawn to port cities such as Key West and fishing. She loved to fish. And she loved the beaches of Brazil. And she also loved travel, you know, when she went to Brazil at first, she had these friends, Lota Jameseiro Soares, and who had been in a relationship with a former dancer, Mary Morse, and she was planning to stop and visit them and continue on. She had bought a ticket to some kind of I don't know if it's a passenger liner or like a just a cargo ship, but she could go, she could stop as long as she wanted at any port going around South America, but she stopped only in Brazil and stayed there and never went on to any of the other ports. But one of the things she also did aside from writing poetry was she painted watercolors, and there's some lovely paintings of the inside of the cabins where she would, when she was on a ship. She liked that being in between places where not much was expected of you. She hated having people expect her to turn out poetry in any kind of regular way. She just had to write, when the idea was, when the moment came. I mean, there are poems that in fact, that's one of the great discoveries in these letters to her psychoanalyst from 1947. In one of them, she's writing about an experience that she'd been in Nova Scotia the summer before, she's writing about in this letter, and she said, and she had been on a bender, and that morning she took her bike to a beach and saw a seal, and the seal's eyes connected. She felt she was communicating with the seal, and anyway, she says, and then I saw the poem. That's what she said. So that, this moment that became a really great poem called At the Fish Houses, she knew that was a moment. She knew that was a poem, but it took her a while to write it. And even longer, in these same letters from 1947, she wrote about being on a bus trip, also in Nova Scotia, and a moose stepping out on the road to stop the bus, and how everyone in the bus kind of was startled. And anyway, it's ended up as a beautiful poem that she wrote almost 20 years later, maybe more than 20 years later, in 1971, I have to do the math, more than 20 years later, called The Moose. And, there that experience had been with her all that time to become the poem, The Moose. So I think I veered off from what the question was. Oh, the sea, right, the sea. Really, another really great poem is called The Sandpiper, about a little sandpiper running the beach. And it's so much more than about the sandpiper. It's kind of about anybody with an obsessive interest in something, such as she did, always looking for something, poor bird. And so there's the sea and the shore, and that, the borders of things interested her very much. So yes, the sea was sea water in that at the fish houses. She talks about putting her hand down into the very cold water and experiencing a kind of knowledge through that. It becomes a metaphor for gaining wisdom, the cold and deep truths of the world. That's in the ocean and at the shore.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And in particular, our author, Megan Marshall. And we hope to have you in Mexico soon to continue this conversation on Elizabeth Bishop and your work. Do you have
Wonderful.
any closing remarks?
Well, I just want to say I'm very thankful for Vaso Roto, for their commitment to Elizabeth Bishop as a poet, and for helping me bring the story of her life that really surrounds these poems and supports the poems to this readers in the Spanish-speaking world, which is such an important, it's the whole world. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We will be posting this press conference and social media of Vaso Roto. Thank you to both Marias in Mexico and in Spain for their support in having this event, making this available. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.